Okay, so welcome everybody. It is the 13th of February on 2021, and we are about to celebrate Valentine's Day tomorrow. And what better way to celebrate Valentine's Day than to talk about zombies and undead things and reanimated creatures? It was complete chance that we picked this day, but I think it's hilarious that it's the day before Valentine's Day. And I did some searching, and apparently there's a whole host of really interesting zombie related Valentine's Day cards out there. I don't know if you knew that, but it's pretty fascinating. We're going to get started here with an interview with our author, Frank Swain, in a moment, but I wanted to first give one of our coordinators for Concatenation Convention, John Hart, a chance to talk a little bit about upcoming events, and then we'll lead into our interview. So, John, take it away.
Awesome. I'm glad to see everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm a coordinator. My name is John Hart. I just kind of got roped into it by Steve Albee Scott and Steve Tuckey and Tim Stairs from the comic shop in town to do this. So this is, I think, our fourth one, and this is our long one because we call it the slow con because we're doing it all electronically. We don't do it. We usually do it on a single day, but this year we are doing it over a period of time. So I just wanted to tell you real quick about some events that we've got coming up. Next, the 20th, we've got a gaming group on Discord. There's all kinds of games that you're going to be able to play on that thing, and we'll get a thing out for that. On the 27th, we've got coming up from Indiana University, from the School of Disability Awareness. We've got a professor coming to talk about Frankenstein and attitudes on disability. And then in March, we've got several things that I won't cover them all, but go to our website and you can check it out. It's jacksonconcon.org, but it's a movie. We have an undead movie series coming up. And then we've got an undead pencil talk with a local comic book artist named Devon Camel, who's going to do a mech drawing of an undead mech. And then a real cool thing that's coming up, and you should mark this one if you don't want to go to anything else, you should try to make this one. It's Stephen Bissett, who was the artist on Swamp Thing when Alan Moore did the run. He's going to be giving a talk for us, and registration will be coming up for that soon. So there's tons of stuff to do. We probably have 20 events between here and the end of April. And then when we're also talking about, last thing, a drive-in at the end of the series. We're trying to put that together, and it'll be a showing of Wes Craven's Swamp Thing out behind one of the malls. So have fun. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to the Steves for having me here, and thank you to Frank for doing this. I really appreciate it. So have a great time, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, John. And we'll post the link to the ConCon website in the chat for you for later on. And just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, you can throw them in the chat. We'll get to them a little later on after we've had a chance to talk with Frank a little bit about his work and his thoughts on zombies and the like. So just a real quick reminder, this is the book that I discovered when I was looking online for cool stuff about zombies and kind of the science behind reanimation. And this is one of the first books that popped up, and I'm so glad it did, because I ordered the book right away. I got it and I devoured it. I just cut through it so fast because it's a fascinating read. At first, it seems like with a title like that, it's going to be kind of, a joke kind of book, but it is the farthest thing from it. It really dives into the kind of the role of scientific research and a look at how we've thought about the idea of zombies historically over the years. And so I want to first start by introducing the author, Frank Swain. And Frank, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, what your background is, and how you came to this topic?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I am a British writer. My background is in biology and environmental science. That's what I actually studied at university. And somehow I just fell into writing. So at the moment I've worked for the BBC. I've written for Wired magazine. I've written for Focus, for all so many I couldn't name them all at once. At the moment I'm working mostly for a communications agency. But yeah, I had a love of writing and a love of science, and I meshed those two together. And I think this book was actually the third paid piece of writing that I ever ever did. So I signed it very, very early in my career, and I look at it now as sort of somewhat of a youthful folly. It was a crazy thing to take on, but it combined my other loves, so my loves of science, my love of writing, and also my love of zombies. So it was a happy time to spend writing this book.
Nice. So this is definitely a field that you were interested in before. It kind of piqued your curiosity and it allowed you sort of to dig into it. Now, when I was reading it, it seemed to me that there were kind of two motivating questions behind the book, and you handle them in different ways with different topics. But the two questions that sort of stood out to me were, number one, how final is this thing that we call death, the lack of life, and then number two, how controllable, both kind of mentally and physically, are individuals by others against their will. And so this idea of zombies being undead, that's only part of the story. There's also this idea of control against somebody's will. And so I'm wondering, based on your research, is that a fair synopsis of kind of the motivation behind the book?
Yeah, yeah, it would have been really nice if there was a third kind of zombie. Three is a great number, but as things stand, the zombie as a pop culture concept, you have everything that is up to 1968, I think, with before George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and then zombies are sticking quite close to the original stories about them, which is someone who is under the control of another person, as mind control. So you have films like White Zombie, I Walk with a Zombie. You have books, like The Magic Island, and the writings by Lafcadio Heron. And then after George A. Romero's movie, it shifts and it becomes a very literal concept of someone who is raised from the dead. So if I'm going to talk about zombies, that gives me two things to talk about. I can talk about the science of bringing people back from the dead, and also the science of controlling people's minds or controlling another's mind. And thankfully for me, those are two great topics with loads of material to discuss inside them.
Yeah. So in terms of the first kind of topic, this idea of controlling people's minds and things like that, you cover a wide range of scientific research and topics and areas in the book, and we don't have time to cover them all. But I'm curious, do you have like a particular favorite, part of your research that really stood out and captivated you?
If we're in terms of mind control, in terms of behavior control, a big impetus for this book was a fantastic book by Carl Zimmer, who's a very famous US writer, and he wrote a book called Parasite Rex, and that came out maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Encourage you all to read it. It's a fantastic book, and there's a chapter on that about parasites which are able to manipulate and control their hosts in various ways to make them a better host for that parasite. And this includes things such as the emerald wasp, which is a beautiful name for a very vicious creature. And the emerald wasp stings, it needs a cockroach, it lays its eggs on cockroaches. And a lot of animals do this. You know that flies will lay their eggs on rotten garbage. Insects want their young to have a good food source when they hatch. And to make sure that food source is fresh, what the emerald wasp does is to lay its egg on a living cockroach. But the thing it does first is to sting it very, very carefully in the brain and inject venom into the brain of the cockroach, which makes the cockroach completely docile. And then you can watch videos, if you look on YouTube, you can find these fascinating videos where the wasp will actually grab hold of the antenna of the cockroach and lead it like a dog on a leash into a little burrow, because it doesn't want anything else to eat the cockroach while it's zombified. And then it will bury it, it'll lay an egg on the cockroach while it's still alive and bury the cockroach in its little tomb and then fly away and do it to another cockroach somewhere else. And then after a while, this egg hatches and the parasite burrows into the cockroach while it's still alive and begins to eat it. And it's very much like like the film Alien, where it bursts out of this cockroach eventually. So very unpleasant story if you're a cockroach. But just one example of some really interesting ways that parasites have learned to manipulate their hosts in the course of evolution.
Yeah, an amazingly ingenious strategy for survival and making use of not just your ecosystem, in terms of the inanimate ecosystem, but the other organisms in your ecosystem, and the ability to have a niche within a niche. It's almost like, and these parasites are
and as Carl Zimmer points out in his book, I think if you weigh them up, there are 4 times as many parasite parasitic species in the world as there are host species. So
Yeah.
parasitism is definitely the norm rather than the exception. It's as you say, it's if you're a bird, you build a nest in a tree, but if for a lot of other creatures, it's building nests and raising their young inside other living creatures.
Yeah. Makes me wonder whether that tree might think of the bird as a bit of a parasite.
Yeah, I mean, if it damages the tree, in a sense, it is.
Yeah.
If you're burrowing a hole into the tree, probably. So it's unpleasant for everyone except the parasites.
So in your research, like for example on the emerald wasp, the ability for the wasp to be able to sting that cockroach and to basically kind of turn off the cockroach's sort of self-preservation instinct and just kind of turn it into a docile being. That's the essence of zombification. That's that first kind of zombification that you talked about.
Mhm.
So this is a pretty common trope in fiction, as you said, prior to the 1960s. But where does that come from? Is that we see it in every culture around the world, or are there some cultures that have it and some cultures that don't?
And that is a great question. Definitely, the fear of losing your humanity is, I think, pervasive in any culture. It's a cultural, it's a manifestation of politics and power within any community. So anyone who's been under the boot of another group of people will, I guess, will solidify these ideas that it's the terror or the horror of losing your power over your own destiny. And interestingly, in Haitian folklore, the first stories that we see coming out about zombies, the notion of a zombie is very, very abstract. And so Lafcadio Hearn, who was a writer for Harper's Bazaar in, I think, about 1880, and he was the first person in the West to write about zombies. And he had this problem that he was going around and he was asking people, what's a zombie? Is it true that a zombie is this creature that climbs out of a grave? And everyone gave him very obtuse answers like, oh, a zombie is like a huge dog that creeps into your house. A zombie is a three-legged horse that passes you in the road, and things like that. And so a zombie was
It's like a
a
catch-all almost.
it's an event that it's a prophetic and doom-laden event. It's something that sort of jars you, something unusual that so serves as a portent of it's an ill omen, as it were.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 1915 when the US occupied Haiti, because the Haiti obviously it was the first Black Republic. They overthrew the slave owners and became their own country, and the sugar growers didn't like that very much at all. So with their insistence, the US military went in and occupied Haiti to ensure that sugar would be supplied to the US. And it was that point that the zombies manifested themselves as someone under the control of someone else. And it was very much a reflection of the political situation at the time. And that kind of solidified this idea of a zombie being a helpless individual who was most often a slave of some context, forced to work against their will.
So in a way, the human politics helped contribute a great deal to kind of the shaping of this sort of amorphous idea of what a zombie was in that particular culture. So I'm curious because I mean that sort of has a rhyme later on in the 1960s when you have somebody like George A. Romero come along and shape zombies into these undead creatures um, as a as a thing that is representative of another political moment in the time. So I'm curious, how did that transition happen? That zombie becomes this sort of different thing. How does that happen in our culture? What do you think?
Yeah, that's the interesting part, isn't it? I think race and politics is very firmly embedded in George A. Romero's film. It was very progressive at its time. It's notable for having a black lead in a time when that was extremely rare for a film with a mostly white cast to have a black lead, and for that character to be the pretty much the only sensible person locked inside that house who kept his head, Ben, against all of the zombies. And yeah, George A. Romero's film, I think, it was the first time, technically, everyone likes to say it was the first time that the zombies were these creatures raised from the dead. Actually, the Plan 9 from Outer Space, the terrible Ed Woodward film, did it a couple of years before. So it was a minor plot point in that, but everyone remembers George A. Romero's film, so we'll call that the birth of the modern zombie. And yeah, it became this very, what's the word? It was symbolic of the proletariat, and very symbolic of the enemy, with both the enemy within and also the people who you were afraid of in some way. And that has manifested itself through all of the zombie films that have come since, and certainly within George A. Romero's film, you see this association of zombies with the downtrodden populace who are put upon by humans. And it's also, as anyone who watches zombie films knows, it's always humans who are the biggest monsters in zombie films. It's never the zombies themselves.
And that's a theme that kind of carries through from Shelley's Frankenstein, of course, right? It's who's the real monster is always the question that comes up as a result of really kind of analyzing that work. So I'm curious, in the history of films, zombie related or zombie adjacent, do you have or books as well, or comic books? Do you have a particular favorite depiction of zombies in some kind of a fictional work? What's your favorite zombie?
My favorite zombie. I'm gonna break character here in a sense that it's not truly a zombie, but the film that George A. Romero made after Night of the Living Dead, The Crazies, and its remake as well, I find especially good. So if you don't know, The Crazies film follows a small town USA scenario, and a military weapon falls into the water source and poisons the people there. And this particular nerve agent drives people to become violently crazy and attack their neighbors. But the genius of this was that people aren't always psychotic. They kind of waver between being normal and being on these psychotic episodes. So you're never quite sure if the person you're with is infected with this or not. And also the things that they're doing to survive, because of course the military comes in and tries to hush it up and kill everyone to keep this thing a secret. You're never sure if the defense behaviors that they're doing are normal human responses or a part of this agent. So I think that was very good at blurring the boundaries of who is the zombie and who isn't.
Yeah. So in your work, you spend a lot of time doing research and even talking to some scientists and working to figure out what has been done in recent past in terms of research into reanimation, mind control, all this stuff. So which scientific fields, if you had to, kind of name names here, which scientific fields do you think have reduced the fears of zombies, if any, and which fields do you think have increased the fear of zombies in terms of the type of research that they're doing and the type of things that have been done?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the book I talk about this concept of apparent death. And apparent death, the phrase doesn't appear until the late 19th century. Up until then, if someone hit you over the head and you didn't respond and you didn't wake up, people just assumed you were dead, and they put you in a coffin and lowered you into the ground. And around the same time, the first humane societies came along, the people who were trying to revive someone who was seemingly dead, had some success. This is where we get the fantastic stories about on the banks of the River Thames in London. You had tobacco enema kits. So this was literally, you would light tobacco and you would push the tobacco up someone's rear end, hopefully stimulating them to come back to life if they'd accidentally drowned. And this concept comes in of like, maybe people who are insensible aren't actually dead. And this terrifies people. People are absolutely terrified of this. And this is where you come in, all this idea of bells attached to coffins through pulleys and tombs. So if you wake up in the grave, you can ring it so someone can come and help you. And you begin to get charnel houses where they store the dead for a few days to wait until they rot, because that's really the only way you can be absolutely certain that someone is dead, is to wait and to see if they start rotting or not. And during that time, there's people whose job it is to go around and with a pair of pliers and pull at the tongues and pull at the skin and toes of these people to inflict a bit of pain to make sure, are they dead or not? Maybe that'll wake them up. So yeah, these early resuscitation methods really, really scared people and really made people realize that maybe it was the motto of the Royal Humane Society was a Latin phrase, lateat scintillas fortran, if I remember it correctly, which means perhaps a tiny spark lays hidden. So this idea that there was some tiny spark of life that might lie hidden inside these people that you could bring back to life. And of course, around the same time, you also have the galvanic experiments where they were applying electrodes to dead bodies and watching how they move. And there was a very famous experiment in London where they did this, and this is the inspiration behind Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley undoubtedly knew of these experiments taking place. Perhaps she even saw them taking place, but they were jolting corpses with electricity and watching them flail around to try and understand, why and what was happening. But a lot of people thought, well, maybe if you get this technique right, you can apply electricity in the way that would bring someone back to life. So yeah, that was really the one that put the fear in people, I think, of the concept of death. Since then, we've gotten really cool with the idea of dying. We're very at ease with the idea of things like open heart surgery, where you can literally stop someone's heart, take it out, put someone else's heart in, or just stop the heart and repair it, or even a heart transplant, put someone else's heart in there. We have life support machines, which are breathing for you, beating your heart for you. We have pacemakers. We accept all of these things, and we're very much, at ease with the idea of a medically assisted life.
Yeah, the idea of the early the early science of resuscitation, and the idea that, where that gray area between where something is alive and where something is dead, that's still with us in a lot of ways. I mean, even at the kind of the microbial level, and the idea of whether an organism is alive or not alive, and the debate still in some circles rages around the question of whether viruses may one day kind of get absorbed into the category of living things, or whether they're going to kind of persist in this sort of pseudo state outside there. So, I mean, this has been around for a long time, but it's so interesting to see how it influences pop culture now. Nowadays, the idea of, shocking and creating some kind of a zombie or a golem with electricity doesn't carry the same sort of fictional weight that it would have, say, in Mary Shelley's time or in H.G. Wells's time. But
I mean, we have plenty of people today who are waiting for Elon Musk to invent some kind of brain upload thing so they can go and live in the Matrix. We're very caught on this idea that our brains, or who we are, you can call it your soul, you can call it your brain, your mind, whatever you like, but that there's some immaterial part of yourself that can be abstracted from your body and can live on in somewhere else. And I think that's problematic for a whole host of reasons. I was just thinking there as you spoke that the fear of being buried alive and the fear that we might be alive and thought of as dead, I think has maybe been flipped, and now we're much more scared of the idea of being dead and being kept alive. I think that's what everyone says, like, don't resuscitate me. If I'm in a coma, like, pull the plug. I don't want to be trapped in my body, in a hospital bed for 30 years. So we've, I don't know, is that maybe the same fear? Where
they got to be related. I would think that they're related. I really do.
But in terms of what you were saying about the idea of death, one of the things that came out for me writing this book is trying to pin this idea of death down. When do you say someone is dead, and when do you cross a threshold which means you're dead? If you get stabbed in the street and you can get transported to the hospital, okay, it's a survivable injury, it's not so bad. If you get stabbed in the middle of nowhere and there's no hospital or doctors nearby, that's a fatal injury. It's the same wound, but whether or not you're going to die from it depends upon the resources that you have around you. And what's really cool, I wrote about in this book, when I wrote about it in this book, it was fledgling research. But we have these experiments going on in Pennsylvania at the moment that are putting people into suspended animation in order to save them. So it is that scenario. If someone is in a car crash, if someone is shot, you take them to the hospital, and the problem is the whole time that you're trying to perform life-saving work on them, their brain is trying to stay alive, their body is trying to stay alive. And to stay alive, it needs blood, it needs oxygen, it needs energy, it needs these things. What we know from a lot of historical medical events is when people are cold, you need a lot less. So we have a lot of examples from the Crimean War. Soldiers who were left out in the cold survived better than the officers who were next to the fires, right up to modern day stories. Anna Bagenholm was a famous skier who crashed through the ice and was underwater for 40 minutes under this icy stream and survived because they were cooled down. So their brains didn't need as much oxygen, their brains didn't need as much energy. And because of that, the small amount of energy they had was enough. So this hospital in Pennsylvania now is running with this, and what they're doing is performing experiments to see if, rather than keeping someone alive when they come in and they're mortally injured, critically injured, I should say, you take out all their blood, replace it with ice cold saline, cool them down as fast as you can, as much as possible, get their body temperature really, really far down, and they don't have any blood, so obviously they're not breathing, their heart isn't beating, they don't have any brain activity, but their condition's not getting any worse. And so you use that time then to find the wounds, stitch them up, repair them best you can. Then you put the blood back into them, you warm them back up, and try to bring them back to life. And when I wrote this book, they were doing this in dogs, and they were managing to keep dogs in this suspended animation state for about 3 hours. It was quite dicey, you know, there was a risk of neurological injury, but now they're working in human experiments. And I think last year or the year before was the first time they actually did this in a human patient. We don't know who it is. They haven't, as far as I know, published the research, but they are doing this. So in the future, you know, if you are in a car crash, if you are in a terrible skiing accident, if you are shot on your way to the bank, it might be that rather than keeping you alive in the ambulance, they'll actually try to kill you instead, and put you into the suspended animation state, and keep you that way until they can safely bring you back.
That's fascinating. And of course, thinking about it from the perspective, kind of a historical perspective, is imagine, you know, turning the clock forward 100 years and then looking back at this moment and just being amazed at how shocked people would be that this is this, of course, this makes perfect sense, in the same way that, you know, if you were to go back 200 years and try to explain CPR to somebody, they would think you're just bonkers. They would not understand what you're doing. So this idea of, you know, the medical science advancing, and right along with it, kind of the fears, the sort of cultural level fears that we have of death and what happens to our bodies, what happens to the tissue. That's kind of goes right along with the advances in medical science. I'm curious. So in your work, I remember there's one particular story that I remember about the the question of what it means to be dead and how it intersects with other areas of human kind of life and human culture. And one of them, of course, is the legal system and what it counts to be dead in a legal sense, and who owns or who has the right to the corpse or the body or the material that is the person. And so there was one story, and I'm gonna get the details wrong, but it was the story about the mother who wanted to harvest her dead son's sperm, if I remember correctly. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so this it's known as perimortem sperm retrieval, and it's that isn't an isolated case. I think it's happened a few times now, where someone, it's usually a fiance. The story I spoke about was unusual because this woman's son was in a car accident, was in brain dead, was not going to wake up, was not going to get better, and she wanted to harvest his sperm so that she could have a grandchild. And in that case, he didn't have a girlfriend, so he didn't have any concrete plans to have children. So it was quite unusual and, I guess, extreme, if you want to use that word, for the mother to say this. But in her words, when they did this, they also took his organs out and donated his organs. And she said, you know, he donated 5 organs, 5 other people got a gift. Where's my gift? Why don't I get something? And sure enough, there were apparently hundreds of women who were queuing up to have this dead man's baby, you know, as a gift to this mother. And yeah, it's a thorny issue that we haven't got around yet, especially with the inverse, which is even more interesting. So there have been examples of women who are in the same condition, brain dead, in a car accident or something like that, and sometimes they do that and they're pregnant, and so they keep the woman alive. Isn't quite the, I guess, you know, it depends on where you stand on this, but they keep keep the person alive in that state for 9 months until they can carry this baby, or 5 months, whatever it might be, to carry this baby to term. And there was a wonderful essay there was an interesting essay by a bioethicist called Anna Smidor, who looked at a couple of cases where they wanted to impregnate the woman. So this, it was the same kind of condition, saying we were planning to have a baby, we were all set to do it. This is our chance to do it. Can we do it? And you would want to, in that case, want to harvest eggs from this woman. But if you harvest that egg from a woman, you're running into these problems of, does she consent? Is that allowable? But then Anna Smedor argued, if you then take that egg and you fertilize it and you put it into another woman, you're risking another person's life.
Yeah.
When there's no medical reason why you can't run that pregnancy inside the woman, who's lying there in the hospital. So it's a very, very difficult area when we blur the boundary of life and death about the ethics of what's right to do and what's not, and what risk is acceptable for, whether it's acceptable to displace that risk onto a living person rather than have the dead person do it. Not ones that I know that we've solved yet.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of zoom back out and then kind of go down the other route, and let's think about the other kind of big question of mind control. And of course, because we're humans, we love thinking about humans and we love making things about ourselves. So I'm curious, you in the book talk about historically attempts at mind control, and the work that has been done in some well, let's just say a little shady aspects of scientific research. And one of them, of course, is the kind of infamous CIA MK Ultra program, and how they really were trying to control minds through use of various things like psychedelics, and so that kind of historically has happened. And of course, it didn't pan out. It didn't turn out very well.
As far as we know.
As far as we know, I think so. Somebody's making me say that. Yeah, as far as we know. But the question, of course, is what kind of an effect does that have on the legitimate uses of medical material? Like psychedelics have pretty recently been touted as a legitimate treatment for depression. And I'm wondering how many years did we have to wait for that research to happen as a result of kind of the shady research that was done. And if you want to talk a little bit about the MK Ultra program and what that meant, feel free.
Yeah, so the MK Ultra program was in the 1960s. We don't know a tremendous amount about it because I think it was Nixon at the time it was on board, ordered all of the records to be destroyed. So there's very little remaining that we can know about this. I don't think that it had a massive impact on holding back psychedelic surgery, psychedelic treatments. I think the war on drugs was far more of an issue there, because it made it very, very difficult to obtain the licenses to stock and to administer those kind of drugs. So we had this idea that there were good drugs and there were bad drugs, and LSD and psilocybin was a bad drug, and and we're still struggling with that. In the UK, we have some terrible drug laws that we brought in, where we said anything that can alter your state of mind is now classed as a psychoactive drug, and it's banned in advance. Even the ones we don't know yet are already banned. So and there were exceptions for alcohol, for coffee, for things that are already covered by the Drugs Act. So it was and the UK did that too, because people were bringing new drugs onto the market coming from China, things like what in the US you guys call it bath salts, in the UK it was called meow meow, MCAT, and cathepsin derivatives. Those were, every time they banned one, they would just tweak the formula and bring it in on a different formula, and there was nothing legally you could do because it wasn't technically banned. So to get around that, the UK government just said, right, now everything's banned. If it affects your mind some way, it's now banned. And so that, again, I think will have problems in holding back research that could otherwise be done, which is a great shame. In terms of the politics of MK Ultra and the politics of mind control, I wrote about a guy in the book, Jose Delgado,
yep,
who was a pioneer of brain stimulation. So he was looking at putting electrodes into the brain that could change your behavior in some way. And he built on work, I think, by Robert Heath, who some say was working for the CIA. Robert Heath himself says that he threw the CIA out. He didn't want to be part of them, but he worked worked with schizophrenic patients. The same idea, putting electrodes into the brain, trying to stimulate the brain in some way to help these people. Again, he did some slightly not cool experiments. He did, I think he was involved in gay conversion therapy for one particular patient. But they had a moderate amount of success. And what the interesting thing was, they could elicit they found they could elicit certain kind of behaviors. So they could make someone search for something. And this person wouldn't even know what they were searching for, but they would start looking around, lifting up pillows, looking under the bed. And when you ask them, you know, what are you doing? They say, oh, well, I'm looking for my shoes. And say, oh, your shoes are right there. Oh, well, I'm looking for something else. They were compelled to search. So you found these really interesting effects that you could have. And Jose Delgado famously put this into a bull and put it onto remote control, and then stepped into the bull ring, and this bull is charging towards him, and then he whips out his remote control and he presses the button, the bull stops, and he presses another button, the bull turns around in circles and it bellows on command, and he has control over this bull using this mind control device, as it were. And he wrote a really interesting treatise, which is very hard to find. I don't think it was ever formally published, called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, where he said everyone should have these implanted in their skulls. And the police could then, if someone was having a psychotic episode, it would read the brainwaves, and the police would be able to send out a radio signal that would stop that person, just as Jose Delgado stopped the bull in the bull ring. And he was by no means a fascist. He came from fascist Spain. He'd fought against the fascists, and yet he still thought that this was the way for everyone to live in harmony together. So it's not clear cut. It's very, very strange, strange attitudes prevail.
Yeah. It's that desire to make a better world that can sometimes lead to unforeseen problems. Let's just say unforeseen problems, right? So that's fascinating, and I really like the idea that scientists can approach a topic, they can engage in research and look for kind of cause and effect. They can do experiments, but kind of separate from that is this kind of axiological fancy word, that the why do we care question, or what value is there question. And so this idea of what value does this bring to us, and so I'm thinking about the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment in terms of psychology, and the attempts to kind of, well, not necessarily the attempts to control, but the result was some really interesting behavioral modification that can happen as a result of not even exciting the brain in particular ways, sometimes just changing external stimulus. And so do you think that, I mean, in the day and age of aggressive marketing and social media, do you think that humanity has changed in terms of our ability to be more or less susceptible to kind of overt, sometimes mind control efforts?
No, not at all. I think we are as susceptible now as we were in Milgram's day and before. I recently interviewed another scientist, this young woman who was recreating Milgram's experiments, but a bit more ethically. And in her setup, you get 5 cents every time you shock your partner. And she said, I was really surprised at how many people would deliver an electric shock for 5 cents, but they like doing it. And she said that of something like 600 people she'd run this experiment on. Should we discuss what the Milgram experiment is in case people don't know?
Yeah, it might be a good idea, yeah.
So Milgram was a psychologist who was looking into conformity, and he ran a very infamous or famous experiment, depending on your point of view, where he encouraged people to give electric shocks to someone behind the curtain. And the person behind the curtain was an actor, but the subject didn't know that. And it was sort of like a pop quiz. They would go through questions, and every time they got one wrong, they would have to deliver an electric shock of higher and higher voltage. And so this person was anguished behind the other curtain, saying, I want to stop. I don't want to do this anymore. Please stop. And the Milgram would be there saying, no, we have to continue the experiment, keep administering these shocks. And he found that people would just keep doing it. And his rationale for this was trying to work out why war crimes happen, why atrocities happen, why people under authority are willing to do really terrible things. Same as the young researcher that I spoke to, she's looking at the same idea. And so we're still we still conform to authority. That hasn't changed at all. And we are still very susceptible to influence from other people. So you talk about, Facebook and Instagram, and this being bombarded by social media trying to influence you one way or another. I would say the difference now is it's much easier, and it's much easier to scale. You can, before you had to be a millionaire, you had to own a newspaper if you wanted to influence people on a grand scale. Now, people are doing it in Eastern Europe out of, for a couple of bucks and an internet connection, are running these sort of fake newsings, pushing out misinformation that is designed to sow discord and create disorder. It's very, very cheap, and it's very, very effective. Yeah, the problem is that we know better, but we don't want to question our sources. We don't want to think critically about things. We're junkies at heart, emotional junkies. And when we see something that triggers our own, our own biases, we click retweet, or we share it, or we leave some comment without thinking very hard about it at all. And the left wing is just as bad as that as the right wing. There is no group of people who are better or worse at doing this. Everyone does it because everyone has that little thing in their brain that feels good when they see stories that chime with their biases, and get angry and have those hate clicks. So it's I think it's just part of the human condition. I think the way to ameliorate it is through regulation of those networks, regulation of social networks. You see already in WhatsApp very famously limited the number of retweets that a message could have, and they started that in India because there were people being what's the word,
Incited.
hung up, basically. Yeah. Based on rumors that were circulating wildly through WhatsApp at the time. Oh, someone in your neighborhood looking to steal your kids, and someone will get killed for it. So it's we can't ask people not to be human, but we can try to temper the tools with which they live out their worst behaviors.
Yeah. So I'll end with this question for our interview section, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, because I can see there's stuff popping up in the chat here. So as we're talking about this, and I'm thinking, wow, it's almost like there's a cultural analog to that wasp that's stinging us in the brain, and it's having an effect, but it's a cultural, not a kind of a physiological or necessarily biochemical thing, although I suppose they're connected. I'm wondering whether you think that what you think about the importance of a scientifically literate society is, and whether science and the practice of science may just be the best antidote to creating more zombies out there. What do you think about that?
I think it's important. I think it's important in this day and age to have a good level of scientific literacy. We are constantly being asked to make decisions that have some basis in science, such as, do we try to have a Green New Deal to lessen our effect on the climate? Do we take a vaccine? Things like that. But at the same time, we are also being asked, on a lot of other challenges. We're being asked about issues with social justice. We're being, tackled with issues of identity. If you want to look at, the Confederate flag and things like that, how we deal with those. We need education of all kinds, and it's not just science. I think, if anything, humanities is the better inoculation against zombies, because it's through the humanities that we teach things like history, like empathy, like community, society. So it's through those, I think, we have the greatest strength at resisting the negative influences and then impetuses that we might have.
Nice. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to have a chat with you. It's wonderful to talk to you. And I'm going to kind of take a look at some of the questions that have been coming in kind of on the side. I trying to watch them and keep an eye and keep a focus on you. So apologies if I missed some as they were coming up that would have been appropriate to sort of interject. But let's see, Steve says humans are not exempt from control by parasites. Much of our behavior is mediated by microorganisms and animals that live inside our bodies. And so like the idea of the microbiome, which is pretty hot
Yeah.
these days. I think that was probably before you wrote this book prior to the microbiome really kind of becoming a big issue in science research. If you were to write a follow-up book, do you think that that would be part of your research? Something like that?
Yeah, I definitely couldn't ignore it now. It's we're finding the microbiome in our guts. There are more. It's a hackneyed phrase, but there are more bacterial cells in our body than human cells, and they do have a big influence on us. And simultaneously, we have parasites living in us. Things like Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite of cats, which gets into rats, and when it gets into rats, it compels them to be more risky and indulge in certain behaviors that make it more likely that they will be eaten by a cat, which is the only organism this thing can reproduce in. But it will infect humans too, and it has some evidence shows it has similar effects in humans, that it changes the way we behave.
Wow.
We become, for example, more outgoing, more social, more risk-seeking. So people who get into car crashes are more likely to have this bacteria living in them. So, is it causing people to have car crashes? Maybe. The interesting thing is if you have this in you, and I know I have this in me, I've been tested, so I've certainly been exposed to it, which isn't a big surprise because I have cats. But do I want to get rid of it? Is being socially outgoing and liking, roller coasters or, gambling in a casino, these are behaviors that we think, oh, quite fun. It's fun to be that kind of person. So if you were infected with a parasite that was doing this to you, would you want to get rid of it or not? It's not quite easy.
I got taken over by toxoplasmosis, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. Right, that's the equivalent of it.
Steve, can I interject for 2
Yeah,
seconds?
feel free. Jump in, Steve.
So Frank, going along that line, they did this study on toxoplasmosis, which is a plasmodium. So it's a single-celled amoeba in a sense. And what they found was in men, it makes them more adventuresome and more quarrelsome. In women, it makes them more nurturing. And so actually women respond totally different, which shows a different kind of mind control when we're dealing with the same organism. It's a very interesting take on how these things actually, we don't really control our lives the way we think we do. We talk about zombies, we're all basically zombified right now. We just don't we just don't realize it because they're part of our nature. So
there's some fantastic research, which I think sadly might have been proven not to be the case, but it's a wonderful idea, which in this experiment, a researcher was looking at, you choose between two objects, an apple and an orange on the table, pick one of them up. And his evidence suggested that the decision is made after you reach for one of the two objects. So your body reaches it, subconsciously you reach for one or the other. And then post hoc, your brain rationalizes this by saying, oh, I was going to reach for the apple all along. So this whole idea that your body and you going around the world is just doing its own thing, and your mind is almost like a parasite sitting on top saying, oh, well, I'm in control. I'm the one that's doing all these things, convincing itself that it's in control when really it's not. And that is truly a terrifying idea.
And no shortage of source material for future science fiction novels and movies and video games, I can imagine. So,
well, let me jump in real quick, because
free,
I
John.
was thinking that throughout your whole talk was, John, by the way, of the idea of zombieism too, though, is that internal paranoia that you're not sure what you're doing is what you're doing, or if you are really doing things. And I think of when you were talking about zombieism, and when we talked a little bit before the call, that idea in The Serpent and the Rainbow, the guy that has no clue like what he is actually doing and kind of wakes up out of a stupor and finds that he's somewhere that he didn't even know he was, and he lived an internal parallel life, thinking that was real. So then, but he was buried or something in like a zombification through some kind of substance that he came across. And then he woke up to what he really was, which he had been kind of like enslaved. So he was having this full internal. So I always think of that, the idea of that dealing with death and all those kind of things is this internal paranoia of is that person next to me gonna pop up and be a zombie and get me, or am I totally not in control of what's happening at all anyways? And then that always points me to thinking about Philip K. Dick, where the whole thing is, am I who I am or what I am, and how do I even know, right? So I think that really came out to me in that conversation, about the whole thing, that internal paranoia, not really sure. And then when you talk about that experiment, it's like, well, did I do that or did I not do that? So very interesting.
Yeah. We had a statement. It's not really a question, but I'll turn it into a question. Have you ever seen, or I don't know if it's based on a book, seen there was I think it's a Netflix show called Fortitude that takes place up in the Arctic. And basically as a result of thaw, there's a kind of anthrax sort of spore thing that winds up infecting wasps, and the wasps sting humans, and it basically causes the same kind of a situation, almost zombification of the humans, to kind of act crazy and do crazy things. Are you familiar with that? Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it, but I do know that this is a real issue. There are bacteria, I should say, there are microbes that are thawing out of places like the Arctic, places like the Russian in Siberia, that pose a risk to us. And so there was a big anthrax outbreak in Siberia. There was the outbreak of something that killed a lot of the Sega, which is this weird deer-looking animal. It looks like something out of Star Wars. It's like a deer with a weird nose. Hundreds of thousands of those were killed in an outbreak. And even in Alaska somewhere, scientists who were looking to study the Spanish flu pandemic went to the graves there because the people were frozen in these graves, and they were able to extract some viable influenza from the lungs of these people. So it's not completely crazy at all to think that there are microbes that are currently frozen that pose an epidemiological risk to us, and to other creatures as they thaw out of the permafrost.
Absolutely. Caleb, one of our attendees, asks, would somebody who's under mind control react the same way to intense pain as someone who's not under mind control? In other words, would that maybe a way of being able to detect this sort of mind control?
That is an interesting question. Pain is so deeply hardwired into us. There's a great phrase that pain demands attention. It's very, very hard to ignore pain. I would say we can numb pain without even changing your brain. I mean, it's quite simple to undergo some kind of anesthetic. So it's not a great test. There's an interesting period of medicine which involved giving women in labor a mixture of drugs. I think it was scopolamine and ether. I might be getting that wrong, but it was called Dammerschlaf, which is a German phrase meaning evening sleep, or twilight sleep. And the interesting thing about this was that it wasn't pain relief. The women who gave birth still went through the pain of giving birth, yet they couldn't remember it. And that's some really, Philip K. Dick stuff right there. Is if you don't remember something, did you actually feel it or not? Very, very strange thing to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some pretty strong research that indicates that some of the active drugs in some of the active chemicals in active molecules in the psychoactive drugs can do just that, can literally kind of connect to these receptors in the brain. They're called cannabinoid receptors for a good reason, because they actually do help kind of reduce that memory production. And so those moments of, I don't remember the pain, so maybe I will have that second child, that kind of thing. Maybe that's a good thing for a species that is.
Even enough alcohol will do this to you. That's a known effect of alcohol, is that it impairs memory formation if you drink enough of it, which is why people don't remember the night before if they have a very heavy night. So it's not far out of fiction at all.
Yeah. So another question, this is from Toriana. How do human zombie stories usually address the question of the soul? Many people consider mind and soul to be different entities, and there's a debate about which has more control over our personalities. And so in your research, what did you find about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the seat of the zombie story, and this is why I think it's so pernicious in all of our cultures.
Yeah.
Is we really want to live forever. We really don't like the idea of dying, and so every culture has this idea that even when you die, somehow some part of you goes on. Your soul, you go up to Valhalla. You join all the angels in the sky. And the zombie really just inverts that myth and says, no, actually, that soul part is going to be the bit that dies, and then the physical part of you is going to be the bit that keeps on going. And that, I think, is the horror of it. That's why we find it so scary. Personally, I don't subscribe to this theory. It's not that I don't think a soul exists per se, but that I don't think it's possible to separate mind from body. This Cartesian dualism, as it's called. And this is why I have a big problem with people who are very into the idea of brain uploads, that we're all going to live in the matrix. I don't see how that's possible. To me, that's like saying I'm going to upload my kidneys. It doesn't make any sense to me to say that you're going to upload your brain. So yeah, you may as well try to upload your brain to a grandfather clock. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. But people love it, and really, all of this transhuman stuff about we're going to live in the matrix and we're going to be in a big simulation is just religion for atheists. It's just...
and by no means are you a technophobe. You are
No.
very much a technologically infused person. You yourself have a great love and interest in technology, and you're a big promoter of technology and thinking about ways of using it and hacking it in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Up until very recently, I had a microchip in my hand, which I put in there for this story, but I took it out again because I had to have an MRI. So I'm back to being not quite as cyborg as I was before.
So another question came up. This is from Diana. Frank, can you speak to the correlations between the idea of a zombie and what religious traditions might think of as possession? And both are controlled by sort of outside entities and have similar traits, and it kind of ties back into this soul thing. So kind of the religious aspect of possession versus the kind of more, I guess you could say, scientific idea of zombies, possession versus control. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is, I think if you go back to the early fiction about zombies, the movies that were made in 1920s, 1930s, it was very much a possession kind of situation. There was a witch doctor, and through some kind of occult magic, some voodoo, they would take possession of another person and, get them to do their bidding. So it was, I guess, targeted in maybe the way that possession is not presented in the same way. Most horror films about possession is, someone just, it's usually a young woman, gets possessed by an evil spirit just out of the blue, not for anything that she personally did. Whereas with at least this witchcraft element of zombie, it's like possession, but it's always there's someone who is consciously in control and has a plan, and their plan is to get this person to do something. So it's it's a great question. It's a very similar parallels.
Yeah, and in a way that I think addresses early on when I was talking about, if you look across cultures, this idea of kind of controlling of other people, that is a pretty common part of common fear across cultures. And as you had mentioned before, let's see if I can find another question in here. Boop, boop, boop. Let's see. Oh, has there been any testing to turn people, and I'll kind of throw it out there and say, or other animals, who are technically dead into zombies? And I'll just prompt this by saying, on the cover of the book, see if you can see it if I hold it just right. On the cover of the book, there is, I'm butchering this because of the stupid background, but there is a dog's head. Oh my God, it's so frustrating. There's a dog's head that's severed, that's, hooked up to a blood supply. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so great question, and the answer is yes. And the even more exciting answer is you can see the videos on YouTube. So if you search for a YouTube video called Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, This was a video made in, I think, about 1940 something.
40s, yeah.
Which purports to show Soviet experiments at the time in bringing animals back from the dead. And the contents of the video are probably a little bit exaggerated, but the kind of research that they are showing off absolutely took place. It was very, very real. And this was Soviet scientists led by a guy called Sergei Bryukhanenko, and Demikov, who were looking at ways of keeping organs alive outside of the body. And so if you work in a slaughterhouse, you will probably know that the heart will keep beating long after you cut it out of the body. So long as it has sort of food and oxygen, it'll keep beating. And these Russian scientists were pushing in that direction. So they were trying to keep lungs alive outside the body, hearts alive outside the body. And through doing this, they built the very first life support machines. So they had to build machines to deliver blood, to deliver oxygen. And so in doing that, we're learning how to keep people alive who otherwise, would have died. So yeah, they took it a step further, and then they said, well, we've got so good at this now with these life support machines, we can actually take dead animals that have been dead for, however, in the video, I think it's a few minutes, they were claiming even up to a couple of hours. We can take these dead dogs, connect them up to our magical machine, which is called the auto-injector or auto-injector. And when we start this life support machine going, it will bring these animals back to life. So yeah, probably wasn't true, but they were certainly trying. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, and honestly, I couldn't thank you more for writing such a tremendous book. This text, and we'll put a link in the chat here in a second. If you're interested, please purchase it on Amazon. Get a copy of it and read this. It's fun reading. It's serious reading. This is not frivolous, but it's really engaging, and the text will keep you engaged around these topics. And now that we've had a chance to talk to you and hear some of your stories and hear some of that background, I really want to just take a chance to say thank you very much for being here today. Thanks for supporting our event, and thanks for sharing your background and experience and expertise with everybody. Really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for being here today. We'll I'll stop recording here, and we'll say thank you very much to Frank. And if you have any kind of last minute questions, you can throw them in the chat. And Frank, I don't know if you have a moment you want to respond to anybody. But...
Yeah, I'll have a moment. But if you also, I'm on Twitter as Science Punk. So if you want to throw questions at me there, then I'll be around a bit longer on there and I can answer them for you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for being here. Keep an eye out for more ConCon events coming soon to a, well, probably computer screen near you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,